Welcome back to the Faculty of Psych. Thank you for joining us today for episode 1, How It All Began. In this video, you'll come to see how psychology has its roots buried deeply in the evolution of the mind, civilization, culture, and most recently, scientific methods of inquiry. Psychology comes from the Greek, study of the soul. In modern understanding, it has come to mean the study of behavior, emotion, and cognitive processes. From east to west, we will investigate the evolution of psychology to give you a more complete, diverse, and integrative understanding of the study of the mind, for which there is no best one-size-fits-all approach. So, let's get started with what we can all agree on. People, cultures, beliefs, and religions are incredibly diverse, making introductory attempts at categorizing such topics reductionist by nature and generalizations at best. So if any part of this video piques your interest, please dive deeper through your own research to further develop your understanding of that topic. In this video, we will cover some of the origins of the field, briefly covering ancient folklore from ancient China, India, Africa, Greece, and the Middle East, followed by an overview of the developments of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and of course, 18th and 19th century Europe. The aim is to show that as far back in time as we choose to travel, people have wondered about what makes us human. Is it a soul, the body, the brain, or the whims of God and unseen spirits? Such wondering has given rise to philosophy, medicine, religion, and of course our very own field, psychology. All are attempts to understand the human condition, what we feel or experience, and how we feel or experience these things, how best to act socially, and what to do when things go wrong. Psychology should not be thought of as uniquely Western. Long before Sigmund Freud and his couch, many cultures had developed a rich tapestry of ancient folk psychology. Every psychologist requires a basic working knowledge of the differences and the similarities between their own culture and the cultures of the demographic they are likely to encounter in clinical practice. This is especially true today in an increasingly globalized, multicultural society. Multicultural practice is so important that it will be covered in a future psychotherapy episode of its own. With all that being said, let's begin. Ancient China. Ancient Chinese psychology was rooted in its philosophical, social, and educational traditions. In the Book of Analects, based on the ideas of Confucius, 5 virtues were recorded. Broadly, the 5 virtues in order of importance are benevolence or ren, righteousness or yi, propriety or li, wisdom or ji, and fidelity or jin. Confucius referred to human nature as sing, reflecting divine order and origins. As social beings, an individual's interactions were supposed to be governed by a shared etiquette of values and socially acceptable behavior known as li. Li was not only expected to be adhered to, but could also be taught by imitating role models who had mastered li, acquiring a state of ren. Ren would be observable in the master's supreme moral development, compassion for others, and appreciation for nature and beauty. The ultimate goal or state to be strived for was known as Tao. Tao translates roughly to harmony or the way in English. The Chinese held a positive view of human nature, considering people to be innately good and well-meaning, born with kindness, civility, wisdom, and a sense of justice or morality. The Chinese conception of evil, however, was embodied in people not adhering to Li or not following Tao, most notably in people pursuing temporary pleasures or wealth. Such pursuits were thought to lead to inevitable conflict or violence, and such an individual needed to be educated in the ways of Li. However, fast forwarding to the present day, despite its rich cultural traditions, the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 resulted in a complete shift away from cultural traditions generally and Western ideas of psychology specifically. The shift was towards a perversion of psychology, highly influenced by Marxist ideas such as class struggle, oppression, and a material world completely separate from mind and soul, being the causal influencer of a person's subjective experience, thoughts, and reasoning. This is referred to as dialectical materialism. There is an overemphasis here on the social nature of reality, people, and how character and mind are shaped predominantly by social life. Ancient India. Indian psychology is truly ancient, dating back many centuries, interwoven with philosophy and the religions of the region. What makes Indian psychology distinct is the multiple conceptions of the human mind and personality, as well as an awareness of differing levels of consciousness and the acknowledgement of the interconnectedness of all things. Atmanam Vidhi, or knowing thyself, was considered the individual's life task, requiring greater awareness of 5 differing levels of consciousness, namely wakeful consciousness or Jagrat, dreaming or Swapna, deep dreamless sleep or Shashupti, illusion representing the veiling of reality or Maya, and lastly, transcendent higher consciousness or Turiya, which could be achieved through deep meditation. Under the above philosophy, people excessively focused on wakefulness are considered to be earthbound and materialistic. An excessive dreaming focus results in extreme idealism and subjectivity. An excessive focus on transcendence and meditation may result in being overly engrossed in mysticism. A balance of the 5 levels of consciousness is therefore key in attaining greater Atmanam Vidhi, or self-knowledge. Lastly, the mind is considered restless in Indian folk psychology, unstable and difficult to control. Thus, discipline, meditation, and constant practice are recommended to gain self-control and a state of passionless detachment from events that risk throwing the mind into chaos, illusion, or Maya. This does not mean to not feel anything, but rather, as the famous adage goes, don't let anything disturb your inner peace. Traditional Africa. When it comes to traditional African philosophy, the orthodox view is that African philosophy and psychology is embodied in the psychology of its rich oral traditions, shared across the generations through proverbs, rituals, and myths, emphasizing an ethos where the entire cosmos is an inseparable, interconnected whole, with kinship permeating communal relationships. This includes animals and plants. In essence, a person is considered a person through their affiliation with the community as a whole. In South Africa, for example, The concept of Ubuntu personifies this ethos. A phrase from the Xhosa language, Umuntu, Ungamuntu, Ungabantu, demonstrates this perfectly, meaning, I am because we are. But please remember not to lose sight of the individual in clinical practice. Some critics hold that the orthodox view of African psychology is contentious, referring to it as a fictitious communal spirit ignoring the diversity of African thought across extremely diverse cultures. This is a valid criticism of any overarching view or theory on people, culture, religions, or nations, because in reality they are incredibly diverse and far from homogeneous. That being said, the very same overarching views do help identify similarities and differences between cultures, and also forms a starting point from which to investigate and more deeply familiarize ourselves in the regional cultural views of our clients or patients. In terms of similarities, the similarities between the above three cultures mentioned so far is fascinating. Although the Chinese focused on propriety and behavior, and Indian folk psychology on self-awareness and consciousness, both emphasize personal development as playing an essential role in the journey to proper personhood. They both additionally consider harmony and interconnectedness, and African folk psychology also holds that the entire cosmos is interconnected and the behavior of an individual ripples out into the community and nature. This means that the individual influences everything else around them and thus makes the aforementioned self-development and self-discovery a necessity. This is, of course, a collectivist focus on well-being of the group, but at the same time, the acknowledgement of an individual and their uniqueness. Please remember this when a textbook or a lecturer tells you that the West is individualistic and the rest are collectivist. There is always nuance. Culture and identity are not static or final. They are constantly in the making, evolving over time. So, let's move forward. Ancient Greece. Western psychology has its roots in Greek philosophy and ideas regarding the relationship between body and mind. Greek thought gave rise to the very word psychology, which means the study of the soul, as mentioned earlier. Initially, the ancient Greeks did not think of body and mind in the way we do today. The mind, or psyche, was the vital force animating a person, which departs once we die. The body, or soma, was the place that the mind inhabits. However, no attempts were made at that time to consider the relationship between the functioning of the body and the mind. A person's thoughts and feelings were attributed to the influence of the gods, meaning ancient Greeks had no real sense of an individual's consciousness, as Indian philosophy and folk psychology did. This view began to change with the emergence of Plato, who asserted the good mind was distinct from the evil body, which influences a person's thoughts and behavior throughout life. For Plato, people were autonomous, possessing an individual selfhood. The mind consisted of three parts, namely, the rational part, the spiritual part, and of course, the part ruled by desire. Please remember this conception of the mind for the upcoming video on Freud and his structural model of the mind. The basic similarities are striking. After Plato came Aristotle, who saw the mind and body as inseparable, working together in unison. The mind makes people goal-directed, and the body is used to achieve these goals. Aristotle's view remained influential in Western culture for centuries after his death. As early as 400 BCE, the father of medicine, Hippocrates, hypothesized that psychological disorders have both a biological and psychological component. Hippocrates proposed that an imbalance of four bodily fluids or humors influenced mood, emotions, and behavior. These humors or fluids were known as black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Two centuries later, in 200 BCE, the Turkish Roman physician Galen built upon Hippocratic teachings. But Galen went further to develop a theory of temperament or personality development, where the four humors represented four elements which could mix to create 9 possible temperaments. The main temperaments were referred to as sanguine, influenced by blood; melancholic, influenced by black bile; phlegmatic, influenced by phlegm; and choleric, influenced by yellow bile. Personality is a topic that will be explored further in a future video, however. But where Galen was innovative in his thinking and ultimately departed from Hippocratic thought was his belief that imbalances could be caused by specific organs in the body. This hypothesis allowed physicians of that time to make much more accurate diagnoses of disorders and their possible causes. The ancient Middle East. The first known records of the establishment of a psychiatric ward refers to such a ward being established in Baghdad at a hospital run by Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi in the 9th century AD. He was one of the first physicians to describe psychotherapy and also discarded the idea of the mind-body dichotomy mentioned in ancient Greek thought. Al-Razi considered mental health and self-esteem to be significant factors affecting both a person's health and mental well-being. This has some minor similarities with the thinking of Aristotle, in that the mind and body were inseparable. Al-Razi was a prolific writer, contributing 237 works in his lifetime, several of which are still available today. In his most popular writing, the Liber Continens, Al-Razi described the definitions, symptoms, differential diagnoses, and the treatment of the mental disorders of his era. Al-Razi treated his psychiatric patients with a combination of diet, medication, occupational therapy-like treatments, aromatherapy, baths, and music therapy. Additionally, he practiced an early form of cognitive therapy for obsessive behaviors. For depression, Al-Razi recommended the teaching of patients to be more hopeful of the future and the possibility their depression may improve. Al-Razi further recommended that physicians be gentle, polite, patient, and kind to patients, treating them with compassion and total understanding. Please remember Al-Razi in a later upcoming video on Carl Rogers and his person-centered approach. Interestingly, once the Baghdad hospital discharged patients, Al-Razi ensured that they receive a stipend for their post-hospital care. Al-Razi was providing a type of psychiatric care seen nowhere else in the world at that time, or for centuries to come in fact, making his approach truly unique. The Middle Ages. Psychologically speaking, the Middle Ages were more of a dark age, with no real exploration of innate human nature. In this period, there were considerable innovations in science, technology, and literature, but the view of human nature was stifled by the dominant influence of the Roman Catholic Church, and their view that human nature was a product of divine creation. Humans were part of a divine drama of salvation and damnation, and other questions about human nature were not particularly relevant at that time. The now Saint Augustine was first to break with this tradition and proposed that humans had a soul that was immortal, but also a unique personality, with the mind as the seat of consciousness and used for negotiating earthly life. Augustine drew this inspiration from Christ's teachings of personal responsibility and salvation. The intellectual climate created by St. Augustine allowed for notions of individual uniqueness, and that in scientific study, the soul, psyche, and the mind all refer to consciousness. This thinking went on to induce the emergence of scientific psychology many centuries later. The Renaissance. The Renaissance was characterized by an incredible expansion of knowledge and ushered in new ways of thinking, particularly about people. Studia Humanitatis, or the study of humanities, developed under the leadership of the Italian scholar Francesco Petrarch, in order to oppose the prevailing religious thought of the Middle Ages. Humanists, such as Francesco, exalted human thought and the notion of autonomous individuals with a mind and will of their own, leading to this type of thought on human nature becoming more prevalent. People were now thought to possess a conscious awareness of self, others, and the intensity of their lived experience. This bears similarities with African, Indian, and Chinese thoughts of interconnectedness. During the Renaissance, the new fields of science, including the humanities, became focused on the objective study of phenomena, including people themselves. But a problem still persisted: how to best interpret the concept of mind. René Descartes, famous for his quote, "I think, therefore I am," offered a solution, re-establishing the notion of dualism of body and mind. For Descartes, we possessed an immortal religious soul, and in his conception of dualism, an ephemeral mind located in the brain's pineal gland, serving as the link with our physical body. The pineal gland was believed to be responsible for all feelings and sensory perceptions. It was not your eyes that perceived vision, or a foot that experiences the pain of stepping on something. Descartes believed it was the pineal gland which perceived such sensations. Today, however, we know the pineal gland is an endocrine gland, secreting the hormone melatonin derived from tryptophan. The pineal gland is responsible for regulating the circadian rhythms of mammals. In other words, the 24-hour cycle of biological processes associated with light, darkness, and the sleep cycle. For Descartes, the body was simply a physical, biological mechanism driven by the hydraulic flow of vital fluids in the body. This view remained prevalent for approximately 200 years, until new discoveries regarding the nervous system and anatomy emerged in the late 18th and early 19th century and beyond. This reinvigorated interest in the nature of human behavior. But, by now, the naturalistic view that human beings, like any other object or phenomena, could be studied scientifically had become mainstream, with no thought being paid to the person's conscious life or experiences. Towards the end of the 19th century, what we would classify as modern Western psychology began to develop. This occurred as physiologists began studying the brain, nervous systems, and sense organs in greater depth. Gustav Fechner provided the most notable work on human sense organs of that time in his book, The Elements of Psychophysics. Fechner was interested in questions such as: How bright must the light be to be seen? How loud must the sound be to be heard? How lightly must the skin be touched in order for it to be felt? Such questions were strictly mathematical and scientific, of course, interested only in the intensity of the stimulus and not with a person's thoughts or feelings about the stimulus. In short, there was a stimulus which led to sensation and then ultimately perception. Wilhelm Wundt was the next influential figure to emerge. Wundt established an experimental psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany in 1879. The establishment of Wundt's lab is generally regarded as the beginnings of psychology as an independent science. From then onwards, psychology began to develop exponentially, developing into multiple schools of thought, which we will cover in the next video. The schools of thought include structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism, Gestalt psychology, the psychoanalytic tradition, humanism, cognitive psychology, metapsychology, and postmodernism. Please keep in mind, the origins described above in this presentation did not occur in isolation. The internationalization of psychology is a concept referring to the fact that multiple factors, such as the interaction between cultures, colonialism, globalization, easier international travel and communication, and of course, the advent of the internet has resulted in the cross-pollination of psychological theories worldwide. Psychology will of course continue to evolve. Integrative approaches will become more mainstream, and nations will additionally develop theories of their own that are more accessible and culturally appropriate to their own populations. Lastly, as you will no doubt encounter as you study further, there is a trend in psychology to decolonize or de-Westernize. There is of course a necessity to do so in order to make these theories and approaches we have discussed and will continue to discuss more culturally appropriate. However, it would be a serious mistake to discount the value of the scientific tradition in favor of indigenous traditional beliefs, religion, and philosophy for their own sake. The scientific tradition developed out of both more or less enlightened periods of European history. The so-called Western tradition of today developed out of unique European, indigenous, traditional, mythological, pagan, superstitious, religious, or philosophical beliefs tied to multiple things like nature, witches, evil spirits, possession, and of course the position of celestial bodies and even the stars. Such beliefs eventually gave way and developed into the scientific, objective study of phenomena, which can be replicated, tested, and therefore be more reliably trusted. Science relates to fact and not to truth, for which people have always relied on philosophical beliefs. Therefore, use the latter to establish a cultural context within which the psychologist can practice to better understand his or her patients and clients in clinical practice. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for watching this episode. If you found the content helpful, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with a friend, classmate, lecturer, or even a psychologist you know. Remember to click on the bell icon to be notified of next week's video, Schools of Thought. Until next week, I wish you good mental health. Bye for now.